The wagon wheels had stopped turning 3 miles back, the sharp squeal of metal against dirt still echoing in Sarah Mitchell's ears. She stood at the edge of a stranger's ranch, her 2 children clinging to her skirts, their small bodies shivering from more than just the evening chill. The sky above them was streaked with the dying light of sunset, a pale orange that barely warmed the dirt beneath their feet. She had $30 left to her name, no family for miles, and a choice that felt like tearing her heart apart. She could leave, try to make it through the night alone, or she could do the unthinkable, ask a man she didn't know for help. The man walking toward them now was tall, his silhouette framed against the darkening sky, his slow steps deliberate and heavy with caution. He stopped just 10 feet away, his shadow stretching long across the dust. Sarah's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, she wondered if she could even speak. The man's eyes swept over her, the ragged dress, the 2 children with bare feet, the broken-down wagon behind them. There was no sign of a husband, no ring on Sarah's hand, just a woman at the end of a rope and 2 frightened children who had no place left to go. "You need help?" he asked, his voice low but not unkind. 3 words, simple but heavy, that would either save them or strip away what little dignity she had left. Sarah felt her knees tremble. She opened her mouth, but no words came. She could hear her heart thumping in her chest, louder than the wind. Then she heard her son, Thomas, whimpering behind her, his voice breaking the silence. He was thirsty. Emma, trying so hard to be brave, squeezed her mother's hand and stared up at the man. "Yes," Sarah managed to whisper. "We need help." But she didn't tell him the full truth, not yet. She couldn't. There was a secret she was carrying, one that could unravel everything he might offer her. Earlier that day, Sarah had walked for miles, pushing the wagon as best she could, praying that it would hold together for just a little longer. But the axle had snapped. The wagon, her only lifeline, had buckled in the middle of nowhere, and all she could do was gather what little she had left, some dried beans, a sack of flour, and a few tins of salted pork, and hope she could make it to the ranch. She hadn't even had the strength to fix the wagon. The children had been exhausted and frightened, their little faces pale with hunger and thirst. Emma had tried to be brave, clutching her brother's hand as they trudged along, but even she couldn't pretend anymore. It had been a letter that had started all of this, the letter that arrived yesterday. Her sister Clara had passed away in childbirth, leaving behind a ranch that Sarah thought might save her. But it had been sold off, and now Sarah had nothing. The last few weeks had been nothing but a blur of exhaustion and fear. After Clara's death, Sarah had been forced to leave their home and travel, looking for somewhere, anywhere, to take them in. And now, standing before this stranger, she knew she was at the end of the line. "We have nowhere else to go," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper, as the man's eyes moved from her worn, dirt-covered face to her children, who were both clinging to her skirts. The look in his eyes softened just a little. It was only a flicker, but it was enough to give her the smallest thread of hope. The man paused for a long moment, his face unreadable. He glanced back at the ranch house, the smoke rising from the chimney, and then looked down at the 2 children. There was no mistaking the need in their eyes. Finally, he sighed, as if a weight had settled on his shoulders. "Come inside. I'll get you some food." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She wanted to thank him, to say something, but the words stuck in her throat. He was offering them food and shelter, something she hadn't dared to dream of for days. She had almost forgotten what warmth felt like, and now, with his simple words, he was offering it to them. As they walked toward the house, Sarah's guilt wrapped around her like a heavy cloak. She was too proud to beg. She had promised herself she would never ask for help, but now, in the face of this stranger's kindness, she had no choice. The weight of her secret pressed down on her. She was 3 months pregnant, and the truth felt like a knife lodged in her chest. What would this man do when he found out? Would he cast them out into the cold night? Would he send them away, just like everyone else had? She couldn't let that happen. Not now, not after everything they had been through. But as she entered the warmth of the house, she made a silent vow to herself. She would never let him find out, not until she was ready to face the consequences. Jonas, the man's brother, appeared at the door, his gaze narrowing as he took in the scene. "You don't know them, Curtis. They could be running from something." But Curtis, the cowboy who had taken them in, shook his head. "Look at those kids," he said softly. "We're not sending them out there." And so Sarah followed them inside, clutching her stomach in silence, her mind racing with thoughts of the secret she had promised herself would never be known. As the door closed behind her, she took one last glance at the darkening sky, and for the first time in days, allowed herself to feel a glimmer of hope. But what would happen when the truth finally came out? Sarah had kept secrets before, but never one this dangerous, and never from a man whose kindness could either save her or break her. The warmth of the ranch house was both a balm and a weight she hadn't expected. Inside, the fire crackled, filling the room with a comforting heat, and the simple meal Curtis had prepared, beans, cornbread, and fresh milk, was a feast to her children, who hadn't eaten like this in what felt like forever. Sarah watched them devour the food, their faces lighting up with every bite. Emma, trying to act older than her years, glanced at Sarah between mouthfuls, eyes wide with gratitude, while little Thomas chattered excitedly about how the food tasted like heaven. Sarah forced herself to eat slowly, pretending that the lump in her throat wasn't there, pretending that her gratitude didn't come with a side of guilt. Curtis was kind, too kind, but she couldn't let him see how much they truly needed him. He crouched down to Thomas's level, offering him more bread, and Emma too, with a smile that reached his eyes. Sarah's chest tightened. She wasn't used to this kind of kindness, and she wasn't sure she deserved it. She watched as Curtis moved around the room, his quiet strength filling the space, while Jonas hovered in the doorway, arms crossed, suspicion still written on his face. Curtis led them to a spare room after the meal, a small, humble space, but clean. He made sure they were comfortable, offering blankets and pillows before retreating to the main room. Sarah stood in the doorway, her children already curled up on the bed, asleep for the first time in weeks without the threat of hunger or cold hanging over them. She closed her eyes for a moment, grateful, yet the weight of her secret was still heavy. "I should tell him," she thought, staring down at her children, their peaceful faces finally free of the fear and exhaustion that had haunted them. "I should tell him that I'm 3 months pregnant, that the child I carry isn't his, and that it's all I have left of James." But she didn't. She couldn't. There were too many reasons to keep it hidden. Too many fears of what might happen if he found out. He might turn them away, or worse, he might look at her the way everyone else had, like she was less than a woman, less than a person because of her circumstances. "I won't let him see me that way." Sarah let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She glanced out the window toward the dark horizon. The sun had long since set, and the night was quiet, still. But inside, everything felt different. There was a warmth here that she hadn't felt in so long, a safety she hadn't known she could have. She reached for the small bundle of cloth she'd wrapped around her stomach and pulled it tighter, as though to keep the secret hidden a little longer. She had to. She had to keep it to herself until she figured out what to do. The next morning, Sarah awoke early, before the light had even begun to break through the darkened sky. She didn't want to feel like a charity case, and she certainly didn't want Curtis to think she was taking advantage of his kindness. So she rose and moved to the kitchen, intent on cooking the small meal she could manage with the few ingredients she had left. When Curtis found her there, already stirring a pot of beans, he raised an eyebrow in surprise. "You didn't need to do this," he said softly, his voice filled with concern, but also a little admiration. Sarah didn't meet his gaze. "I won't take charity," she replied, forcing the words out with a conviction that she didn't entirely feel. "Let me work for our keep." Curtis didn't press the issue further, but he gave her a look that she couldn't read before he moved toward the table, setting up breakfast for the children. Emma quickly joined them, eager to help, setting the table as Thomas drew pictures with flour on the floor. Sarah watched them with a soft smile. The awkwardness of the morning was a relief. There was no need for forced conversation, just a simple routine. Jonas stepped outside to speak with Curtis. Sarah didn't know what they were discussing, but she could see the tension in Curtis's shoulders when he returned. He didn't say much, but there was something in his eyes, a guarded look that made Sarah uneasy. Despite everything, she kept working, cleaning, washing, and cooking as best as she could. But as the days went on, she started to feel the strain. The pregnancy was making it harder to keep up with the chores, and though she tried to hide her exhaustion, Curtis began to notice. He caught her leaning against the wall, clutching her stomach, her face pale as she struggled to catch her breath. "Sarah, you need to rest," he said one afternoon, walking toward her with concern in his eyes. She pulled away quickly, refusing to let him see just how badly the pregnancy was taking its toll. "I'm fine," she insisted, her voice tight. "I need to earn my place here. I won't be a burden." Curtis frowned, but didn't press her further. He was a man used to doing things on his own, not used to offering help, but the kindness in his eyes was undeniable. The children were thriving, though, and that made all the difference. Emma had started helping around the ranch, and Thomas followed Curtis around like a shadow, learning to rope and tending to the animals with the enthusiasm of a boy who finally felt safe. Curtis had even made Thomas a wooden horse, a simple gift that meant the world to the child. And as the days passed, Sarah found herself looking at Curtis differently. She couldn't deny that there was a warmth in his eyes when he looked at her, a kindness that was beginning to chip away at the wall she had built around her heart. But the fear was still there. She had to keep her secret, and as much as Curtis tried to be gentle, as much as he tried to help, Sarah couldn't let him get too close. Not yet. It wasn't until she stumbled one morning, a heavy wash basket in her arms, and nearly collapsed from dizziness that Curtis saw how badly she was struggling. He caught her before she hit the ground, his strong arms supporting her. For a moment, their eyes locked, and something passed between them, a moment of understanding, of tenderness. Curtis's voice was firm with concern as he asked, "When's the last time you rested?" Sarah's breath caught in her throat, and she pulled away from him quickly. "I'm fine," she said, her voice shaky. But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't true. She wasn't fine, but the thought of telling him the truth terrified her even more. She had to hold it together. For her children, for herself, and for the man who, despite his own struggles, had given them a place to belong. Curtis caught Sarah before she hit the ground, his strong arms wrapping around her. And for the first time since her husband James died, Sarah felt what it meant to be held by someone who wasn't demanding anything in return. Her body went limp in his grasp, her head spinning not just from the dizziness, but from the realization that this man, a stranger only weeks ago, now seemed like the only person who saw her, truly saw her, as more than just a widow struggling to survive. "When's the last time you rested?" Curtis asked, his voice firm with concern, his grip on her arms gentle yet insistent. Sarah quickly pulled away, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm fine. Just the heat," she replied, the words coming out too quickly. She was embarrassed by her weakness, embarrassed by how much she needed him, though she would never admit it. Curtis's brow furrowed, clearly not buying her story, but he said nothing more as he helped steady her. His eyes lingered on her for a moment too long, and in that moment, Sarah could feel the weight of something unspoken between them, something that had been building ever since the night they arrived. She couldn't allow herself to acknowledge it, not yet, not with everything she was hiding. She took a deep breath, pushing away the dizziness, and tried to focus on the children who were playing nearby, oblivious to the fragile state of their mother. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that Curtis had seen too much. He knew something was wrong, even if he didn't know what it was. That evening, after dinner, Sarah excused herself to the quiet of the spare room. her hands trembling as she undressed and prepared for bed. She knew she was failing to hide the truth from Curtis. The exhaustion in her bones, the sudden dizziness, and the way her body seemed to be betraying her with every passing day. She couldn't pretend any longer. But how could she tell him the truth? How could she reveal that she was pregnant, carrying a child that wasn't his, knowing that the truth would likely tear apart the fragile safety they had found? Sarah lay awake long into the night, staring at the ceiling, wrestling with the decision that felt like it was swallowing her whole. The days blurred together in a haze of exhaustion and guilt, but with each passing hour, something inside her began to shift. It was in the way Curtis looked at her, the way his voice softened when he spoke to her or the children, and in the way his kindness seemed to seep into every corner of the ranch. She couldn't ignore it anymore. She was falling for him. It was ridiculous, she told herself. She couldn't afford to feel anything for a man who could never love her the way she needed. And yet, she found herself thinking about him constantly. When she woke in the morning, there he was, already working, already carrying the weight of the ranch on his shoulders. When she worked alongside him, she found herself looking at him more often than she should. It wasn't just the way he made sure they had enough to eat, or the way he had shown them the simple comforts of home. It was the way he treated her. He didn't ask questions. He didn't judge. He just helped. Sarah could hardly remember the last time someone had treated her like she mattered, like she was more than just a burden to be carried. And yet, she couldn't let herself believe that Curtis's kindness could be anything more than that, just kindness. The morning after her near collapse, she found herself standing in the kitchen, making breakfast for the children, trying to act like everything was fine. Curtis's soft footsteps approached, and he placed a hand on her shoulder as he leaned in to speak. "You can't keep pushing yourself like this," he said quietly. "I know you don't want to be a burden, but I don't want you to wear yourself down either." His words stung more than she expected. He wasn't just concerned for her physical well-being. He was really seeing her in a way that made her feel both cared for and vulnerable all at once. Sarah nodded, not trusting herself to speak, and turned away quickly to hide the tears that had sprung to her eyes. She couldn't keep doing this, couldn't keep pretending that she wasn't falling apart inside. The truth was, she was scared of what Curtis might think of her if he ever found out what she was hiding. Scared of how she might lose this fragile connection they were beginning to build. And even more than that, she was scared of what would happen if he knew about the baby. Would he leave? Would he look at her with pity? Or worse, would he resent her for the life she was carrying that wasn't his? It wasn't until 3 weeks had passed that Sarah began to settle into the rhythm of the ranch. She worked alongside Curtis, cooking meals, mending clothes, and keeping the house as clean as she could. Emma and Thomas had both found joy in the ranch's simple pleasures, and Sarah couldn't help but smile at their laughter as they played. Curtis had even shown Emma how to ride one of the horses, and Thomas had taken a shine to helping with the animals, following Curtis around like a shadow. As the days passed, Curtis's presence seemed to become less of a stranger and more of a comfort. They would share quiet moments together, passing dishes, steadying a ladder, lingering touches that neither of them acknowledged but both felt. They had fallen into an unspoken routine, one that felt easy, like it had always been this way. But all the while, Sarah's secret continued to grow. The fear she carried with her, like a shadow that never left, began to weigh heavier as her pregnancy progressed. She had stopped wearing her old dresses, knowing they no longer fit, but she made sure to hide her growing belly under layers of clothing. The morning sickness that had plagued her for weeks had slowed, but her body still ached with the strain of the work. She could feel herself weakening with each passing day, but she couldn't bring herself to stop. And then the trip to town came, a seemingly simple errand that would shake everything. Curtis had taken the family to town for supplies, the children excited at the prospect of seeing the small, bustling settlement. Sarah, however, felt a knot of anxiety in her stomach. She had hoped to remain unnoticed, to keep their presence as unremarkable as possible. But the moment they stepped into the general store, she knew it wouldn't be that easy. Mrs. Harlow, the sharp-eyed shopkeeper, watched them closely, her curiosity palpable. "How long is your housekeeper staying, Curtis?" she asked, her voice too loud, her eyes lingering on Sarah with more suspicion than Sarah could bear. Curtis stiffened, a protective instinct rising in his chest. "That's her business, not yours," he snapped, and Sarah felt a brief pang of gratitude. She had expected him to be kind, but hearing him defend her like that made her realize just how far they had come. But even as Curtis paid for the supplies, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. And then, as they stepped outside, it happened. A man on horseback pulled up alongside them and stared at Sarah with an intensity that made her blood run cold. Her heart pounded, and she instinctively pulled Thomas closer. The man tipped his hat, his eyes narrowing for a split second before he rode away, leaving Sarah frozen in place. Curtis didn't miss the look, and his question cut through the air like a knife. "You know him?" he asked, his voice calm, but there was an edge of something darker in his tone. Sarah's pulse raced, and she shook her head. "No, I don't," she lied. But even as she said it, she knew Curtis was beginning to see through her facade. The cracks were starting to show, and Sarah wasn't sure how much longer she could hold them together. Sarah's blood turned to ice when Jonas cornered her in the kitchen. She had hoped that, by some miracle, she could keep her secret hidden, but Jonas had the sharp eyes of a man who'd seen too many women bear children. He knew. The weight of his gaze made Sarah's chest tighten, and before she could even find her voice, he asked, "Does my brother know?" The words were simple, but they struck her like a slap. She took a step back, her heart racing. "Please," she whispered, desperation clawing at her throat. "Don't tell him." Jonas stood in the doorway, unmoving, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched between them like a thick rope, and for a moment, Sarah thought she might choke on the guilt. Jonas finally spoke, his voice low. "Why shouldn't I? He deserves the truth, Sarah." His words echoed in her head, twisting and turning, but she knew they were true. Curtis deserved the truth, but Sarah couldn't bring herself to give it. Not yet, because, she said quickly, trying to hold herself together, "He'll send us away. My children will have nowhere to go." She was barely able to hold back the tears as the words spilled from her. Jonas softened his stance, but his eyes still held that knowing, probing look. "So, you'd rather lie to a good man? Use his kindness." The accusation stung, and Sarah's pride flared. "I'm not using him," she shot back, the words sharp. "I work. I earn our keep." Jonas took a step closer, his voice gentler now. "Until you can't. Until you're bedridden. Then what?" Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The words hit too close to the truth. She could already feel her body weakening, and there was no way she could keep up the charade forever. Her pregnancy, once a secret she could hide beneath layers of clothing and exhaustion, was becoming impossible to conceal. Her hands trembled as she clutched the edge of the counter, the weight of Jonas's gaze too much to bear. The guilt she had been holding back finally spilled over, and she whispered, "This baby is all I have left to my husband." Her voice broke, the pain of the loss flooding back like a wave. Jonas's eyes softened just slightly, but his voice remained firm. "Then why hide it?" Sarah shook her head, as if trying to escape the truth that was now hanging in the air. She had never told anyone about the whispers in town, about the things the women had said when they found out she was pregnant. "Because I've been called terrible names," she said, her voice barely a whisper, as if the words themselves might burn her. "Because people said the baby wasn't James's, even though it was." She closed her eyes for a moment, the memory of their cruel words still sharp in her mind. "Because no one wants a widow with children and a baby on the way." The words felt like a confession, a weight lifting from her chest, but they didn't make her feel any lighter. They only made her feel exposed. Jonas stared at her for a long moment, and Sarah could see the flicker of sympathy in his eyes, but it didn't ease her discomfort. "I'm terrified," she whispered. "Terrified of losing everything, of being cast aside like I've been before. I won't survive it again." The room fell silent. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest as she waited for Jonas to speak, to say something that would either offer her some sort of reprieve or shatter the fragile thread of hope she had left. He didn't say anything at first. Instead, he took a deep breath and looked away. "You have until tomorrow," he said finally, his voice almost gentle. "Tell him, or I will." Sarah's stomach twisted with fear, and she felt as though the floor had dropped out from under her. "Please," she begged, her voice small and fragile. "Please don't make me do this." But Jonas didn't soften. "I won't let you keep hiding it from him, Sarah. He deserves the truth, just like you deserve to stop carrying this alone." He turned and left the kitchen, leaving Sarah standing there, her hands shaking, her heart breaking. The weight of the decision pressed down on her, and for the first time in days, she felt like she was drowning in her own fear. That night, Sarah barely slept. Her mind raced with thoughts of Curtis, of the life they had built together, fragile as it was. She couldn't stop thinking about the way he had looked at her, the way he had treated her, the way his kindness had started to fill the empty spaces inside her. And yet, every time she thought about telling him the truth, a deep, gnawing fear settled in her chest. What if he left? What if he couldn't forgive her for hiding the truth? What if everything she had come to care about would be ripped away in an instant? After all, this wasn't just a man who had shown her kindness. He was a man who had lost so much himself. He had buried his own grief, and she feared that her secret would be one too many burdens for him to bear. But then a new thought emerged, one that had been there all along, buried beneath her shame. Maybe I'm not the only one who's afraid. She couldn't deny the way Curtis had looked at her, the way his eyes softened whenever he spoke to her. She couldn't deny the way he had helped, not out of duty, but out of something else, something that didn't fit into any box she could define. Maybe he wasn't the only one who had something to lose. Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, her hands trembling as she watched her children sleep. They had finally found some peace, some semblance of security in the life Curtis had given them. And yet, she could feel the ground beneath her slipping away. She had spent so long trying to protect them, to keep them safe from the world, but she hadn't counted on the possibility of her own heart being torn apart in the process. She knew she had to tell Curtis the truth, but telling him meant everything would change. She could feel the weight of the decision pressing on her chest, suffocating her. But she had no choice. If she wanted a chance at happiness, if she wanted her children to have a real future, she had to take the risk. Tomorrow, she would tell him, but she didn't know if she could survive the consequences. The kitchen was still and quiet, save for the faint creaking of the wooden floorboards beneath their feet. Curtis stood at the doorway, the letter in his hand, the weight of it heavy between them. Sarah's heart dropped at the sight of it, and she knew instantly that he had found her confession. The words she had written in the dark hours of the night had been meant for his eyes only. Yet now they stood between them like an insurmountable wall. She had barely taken a breath before Curtis's rough voice broke the silence. "Where are you going?" His tone was low, almost gentle, but there was an undercurrent of emotion that she couldn't ignore. Sarah opened her mouth to speak, but the words stuck in her throat. Her mind raced, her hands trembling as she fumbled with the hem of her dress. She had thought that leaving, fleeing before he discovered the truth, was the best option, but now, seeing the hurt in his eyes, she realized that running wasn't an option anymore. "I thought," the letter explained, she whispered, but she couldn't finish the sentence. Curtis moved toward her, his steps steady but filled with an intensity she hadn't expected. "It didn't explain anything, Sarah. It explained that you were hiding something from me." The pain in his voice pierced her heart, and she wanted to apologize, to take it all back, but the words wouldn't come. He knelt down, gently taking Thomas from her arms, the little boy still asleep and unaware of the storm that was brewing around them. Emma stood at the edge of the room, her eyes wide, sensing that something important was happening. Sarah swallowed hard, her throat tight with the weight of everything she had been hiding. "Mama, what's happening?" Emma asked, her voice soft but filled with worry. Sarah turned toward her daughter, trying to gather the strength to speak. "Everything's all right, sweetheart," Curtis said, his voice warm and reassuring as he gently took Emma's hand. "Your mama just got confused for a moment, but everything's fine now." Curtis's kindness only made Sarah feel worse. He was protecting her, shielding her, but the truth was already out, and it was too late to undo it. As he helped Emma sit down at the table, Sarah could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She had wanted to keep this secret hidden, to protect herself and her children, but now there was no turning back. Curtis's gaze was still soft but filled with something she couldn't quite name. It was as if he was waiting for her to say something, to explain herself. But she had no explanation. She had done what she thought was best, but now she was trapped in a web of her own making. "Sarah," Curtis said gently, breaking the silence again, his voice steady but filled with a quiet desperation. "Tell me everything. The real story." His words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything that had come before. Sarah took a deep breath, her chest heavy with the confession she had kept buried for so long. She had thought she could protect her children, protect Curtis, by keeping the truth locked away, but now it was time to face it. "James died in a mine collapse," she began, her voice trembling. "I was left with Emma and Thomas, and 2 weeks later, I found out I was pregnant again." The room seemed to shrink around her as the words tumbled out, and she could feel Curtis's gaze on her, steady but filled with questions. "At first, I thought I'd be able to manage. I thought we could make it on our own, but the people in town, they started to talk." Her voice faltered, but she pressed on. "They said things. They said the baby wasn't James's. They said I didn't wait long enough after he died to start over." She paused, the shame she had carried for so long resurfacing. "I couldn't take it. I couldn't bear the whispers, the way they looked at me, like I was some kind of a sinner. So I left. I came to Clara's, thinking it would be a fresh start. But then she died, and I had nowhere to go." She swallowed hard, the tears welling in her eyes as she stared at Curtis. "I didn't tell you because I was afraid. Afraid that if you knew, you'd send us away. I couldn't bear it. I couldn't lose the only thing that mattered, my children. And now," her voice broke, and the words hung in the air like a fragile thread. Curtis didn't speak immediately, and the silence between them felt like an eternity. She could feel the weight of his judgment, the questions swirling in his mind. But when he finally spoke, it wasn't what she expected. "You're right," he said quietly, his voice filled with a quiet understanding. "I don't know everything, Sarah, but I know one thing. You're not the only one who's been through hell." His words caught her off guard, and she looked at him, her heart beating faster. Curtis stood and walked toward the fireplace, his back turned to her as he seemed to gather his thoughts. "I had a wife," he said, his voice low and steady, but there was a tremor in it. "Her name was Anna. We had a daughter, Beth. 5 years ago, fever swept through, and in 1 week I lost them both." His words hit Sarah like a slap, and for a moment, she couldn't breathe. She had known that Curtis had suffered loss, but hearing it from him, hearing the rawness in his voice, made her realize just how much pain he carried. "This house, it died with them," he continued, his eyes distant. "It's just me and Jonas rattling around here like ghosts." The sadness in his voice cut through her, and she realized just how much of a burden he carried, how much he had hidden behind the walls he had built around himself. "I stopped hearing laughter. I stopped remembering what it felt like to have purpose. Then you 3 showed up," he finished quietly. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she processed everything he had said. She had been so focused on her own pain, on her own fear, that she hadn't seen the depth of Curtis's grief. He had been carrying his own brokenness, his own wounds, and he had been offering her a chance to heal. He wasn't just offering her shelter or food. He was offering her something more, something she hadn't dared to hope for. When I read that letter, Curtis said, his voice breaking slightly, my first thought wasn't anger. It was terror, because I realized I'd already lost my heart to you. Sarah's chest tightened, and for the first time, she realized that the bond between them wasn't just one-sided. It wasn't just her afraid of losing him. It was him, too, afraid of what could happen if they didn't take this chance. The moment hung in the air, raw and tender. But Curtis wasn't finished. I don't care about the baby, Sarah, he said, his voice firm, filled with resolve. I care about you, and I care about those kids. You're not alone. Not anymore. Sarah looked at him, her heart full, and the words she had feared to say for so long finally left her lips. Curtis. She couldn't finish because Curtis stepped forward and gently cupped her face in his hands, his thumb brushing away the tears that had been falling without her realizing. You don't have to say anything, Sarah. Just let me show you what it means to have a home again. The morning after Curtis found her letter, Sarah sat by the window, watching the first light of dawn slowly break across the sky, painting the world in shades of gold and rose. She hadn't slept at all, her mind too full of everything that had been said between her and Curtis. His words echoed in her mind, their weight both a comfort and a challenge. You're not alone. Not anymore. Those words felt like a lifeline, but they also felt terrifying. Could she really let go of the wall she had spent so long building? Could she risk her heart again after losing everything once before? And what about her children? Emma, who had started to call Curtis Mr. Curtis without understanding the change in their lives, and little Thomas, who had already claimed him as his hero. Sarah's heart ached as she thought of them. Her children had found a home here, in this place where they had once been strangers, and she wasn't sure if she could bear to take that away from them, to take that away from herself. Curtis had made it clear that he cared, but could she truly believe that? Could she trust him with the truth of her heart, with the weight of the choices she had to make? She didn't have the answer, but the question lingered in the quiet of the room. The sound of footsteps outside broke her reverie, and she turned to see Curtis enter the room. His presence, as always, felt both solid and soothing. He hadn't said much since their conversation the night before, but the warmth in his eyes made her think that he understood her hesitation, even if he didn't fully grasp the depth of her fear. He gave her a quiet smile, but it didn't quite reach his eyes, as if he, too, was waiting for something. Sarah couldn't stay silent any longer. Curtis, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He turned to her, his expression softening, his shoulders relaxed. You don't have to say anything right now, he said gently, but Sarah could see the uncertainty in his gaze. He was waiting for her to speak, for her to make the choice that would change everything. The silence between them felt heavy, like a decision was hanging in the balance. Finally, Sarah took a deep breath, her hands trembling as she looked out the window again. I don't know what to do, she confessed, the words escaping her before she could stop them. I don't know if I'm strong enough to let someone in again. I don't know if I'm ready to love someone like that, like I love James. Her voice caught in her throat, and she quickly wiped away the tears that had begun to form. Curtis stepped closer, his hand reaching out to steady her as if he sensed the turmoil she was feeling. He didn't speak at first, just held her gaze with quiet understanding. Finally, after a long moment, he said, I'm not asking you to love me right now, Sarah. I'm asking you to take a chance. Take a chance on what could be. Take a chance on us. His words were simple, but they were everything. They were the promise of something more, something better than the survival she had been living. Curtis's voice was firm but gentle, filled with hope. I know you've been hurt, and I know you're scared, but I'm not asking you to figure it all out right now. I just want you to know that whatever happens, I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. Sarah's heart clenched as his words sank in. She had spent so much time hiding from the possibility of something more, of something that might hurt her again. But Curtis wasn't asking her to dive in head first. He was asking her to take one small step, to trust him in ways she hadn't trusted anyone in years. She closed her eyes for a moment, taking a shaky breath. "And if I say yes?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Curtis smiled, and for the first time, it reached his eyes, lighting them with something she hadn't seen before. Something like hope. "Then we take it one day at a time," he said. "No pressure, Sarah. If you say yes, we take it slow. We figure this out together." The weight of his words settled in her chest, and for the first time in a long time, she felt like she wasn't carrying everything on her own. There was something there, something in Curtis's presence, that made her believe it might be possible to rebuild what she had lost. But then the doubts crept in again. What if she wasn't enough for him? What if she wasn't strong enough to be a mother to 3 children, to be a partner to Curtis, to carry all the burdens of the past while building something new? She could feel the fear rising in her chest again, but Curtis was still standing there, waiting, his quiet patience offering her the space she needed to make her choice. "I can't promise you perfect," Sarah said, her voice breaking slightly. "I can't promise that I won't make mistakes, or that I won't doubt myself. I'm still carrying so much of the past, and I don't know if I can be what you need." Curtis shook his head, his expression soft. "You don't have to be perfect, Sarah," he said quietly. "I don't need perfect. I just need you to be willing to try. That's all I'm asking for." Sarah swallowed, the lump in her throat threatening to choke her, but she could see it in his eyes. This wasn't a question anymore. Curtis wasn't asking for her to be anyone but herself. He wasn't asking her to erase the past or forget what had happened. He was asking her to take a chance on something new, something that could grow between them if she was willing to believe it was possible. She took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. "I want to try," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I want to try, Curtis." His eyes lit up, and he stepped forward, pulling her into his arms in a gesture that was both gentle and firm. "Then we'll do it together," he murmured into her hair, holding her tightly, as if he knew that the choice she had just made wasn't just about them. It was about a future they could build, one day at a time. The sound of the children's laughter in the yard reached them through the window, and for the first time, Sarah felt the stirring of hope, not just for herself, but for all of them. This wasn't the end of the journey. It was the beginning of something new. The question wasn't whether she could let go of her past. The question was whether she could trust in the possibility of the future. And for the first time in years, Sarah believed it might be worth a risk. The morning dawned crisp and clear, the sun rising slowly over the Montana landscape, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and orange, a promise of new beginnings. The warmth of the day was a stark contrast to the cold, difficult months Sarah had spent just trying to survive. But today, something was different. Today, she wasn't just surviving, she was living. Curtis had gone to town early, leaving her with the children, and Sarah could feel the weight of the decision they had made hanging in the air, but not in the way it had before. This time, it felt like something more. It felt like they were truly building something together, a home, a future. She watched Emma and Thomas as they played in the yard, their laughter light and full of life. And for the first time in what seemed like forever, Sarah allowed herself to feel hopeful. Curtis returned later in the morning, leading Minister Bowen with him. The elderly man was kind and patient, his weathered face full of understanding. Sarah smiled faintly at him as Curtis gave her a quick, reassuring glance, one that seemed to say everything would be all right. And for the first time, she believed him. The children were excited, nervous energy swirling around them as they got ready. Emma, in her new dress, spun in circles, her face glowing with happiness, while Thomas was more concerned about whether he could keep his shoes clean long enough for the ceremony. Jonas, having set everything in motion, was helping where he could, making sure everything was in place for the simple but beautiful ceremony. The ranch hands, Dawson and Reed, had come inside, standing awkwardly in the corner, watching the preparations. Mrs. Harlow from town had also arrived, bringing a small bouquet of wildflowers as a peace offering, her eyes full of curiosity and perhaps even a little regret for the way she had once spoken of Sarah. The house was small, simple, but it was filled with warmth, and Sarah couldn't help but think of how far they had all come. She hadn't imagined this moment, hadn't allowed herself to hope that it might come, but now that it was here, she couldn't ignore the feeling that the world was changing before her eyes. Curtis, looking every bit the rancher, but also something more, a man who had found a family he didn't know he needed, stood by her side, holding her hand, his eyes never leaving hers. She could see the quiet joy in him, the way his smile had softened over the weeks, and it made her heart swell. Curtis wasn't just offering her a life. He was offering her a future, a family, a chance to belong again. Sarah wasn't sure if she was ready for all of that, but in that moment, she realized she didn't have to be. She didn't have to have everything figured out right now. She just had to trust that it would come one step at a time. As Minister Bowen began the ceremony, the words felt like a gentle rhythm, a promise. Sarah stood there, holding Thomas in her arms, her heart pounding as Curtis's voice, steady and sure, echoed in the room. I, Curtis Jackson, take thee, Sarah Mitchell, to be my lawfully wedded wife. The vows were simple, but they carried a weight of love, of patience, of everything they had already built together. Curtis promised to love her children as his own, to be the father they deserved, and Sarah felt her heart flutter. She couldn't promise him perfection, but she could promise him that she would try, every day, to be worthy of the family they were becoming. Her vows were quieter, but just as full of meaning. I can't promise you perfect, she said, her voice shaky but filled with determination. I can't promise I won't stumble or doubt or be afraid, but I promise to try. Every day I'll try. You've given me a home. Let me give you a family. The words felt like a vow not just to Curtis, but to herself, to her children, to the life they had built together. When Minister Bowen asked for the rings, Curtis reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple gold band, one that had belonged to his mother. The same band that had been passed down through generations of Jacksons, a symbol of enduring love. As he slid the ring on his Sarah's finger, his voice was filled with quiet pride. With this ring, I thee wed. When Sarah took the ring from the minister and slid it onto Curtis's finger, she felt the weight of that promise settle in her chest. She wasn't just marrying Curtis. She was marrying the life they would build, the family they would become. With this ring, I thee wed, she whispered, and the words seemed to settle over them like a blanket, wrapping them in warmth and belonging. Curtis kissed her then, gently, but with a promise in every movement, a promise that they would face whatever came next together. The kiss was sweet, soft, filled with a tenderness that left Sarah's heart racing. The children giggled, and even Jonas, standing quietly by the door, seemed to soften. You may kiss your bride, Minister Bowen announced, and the room erupted in laughter, light and unrestrained. The joy in the room was palpable, and Sarah felt her heart lift as she watched Curtis pull her close. You, Thomas said, making a face, but even he couldn't help the smile that tugged at his lips. Emma's eyes were wide, her face flushed with happiness as she looked up at Sarah. The ceremony had been simple, but it was everything they needed. It was a promise, a new beginning, a moment of joy in the midst of everything they had survived. The celebration was modest, but full of warmth. Cake, coffee, and music. Dawson played the fiddle, Reed picked up the harmonica, and the house filled with music and laughter. Curtis danced with Emma, his hands strong and steady, while Jonas shared a quiet moment with Sarah. As the evening wore on, the sounds of life, of family, filled the space around them. Sarah watched as Curtis carried Thomas to bed, the little boy already asleep in his arms, and Emma followed behind them, her small hand gripping her new father's sleeve. Sarah stood at the doorway, her heart full as she watched the two of them disappear into the hallway. This was the life she had dreamed of, one filled with laughter, with love, with second chances. As the last of the guests departed and the ranch fell quiet again, Sarah stood on the porch with Curtis, the evening air cool against her skin. They didn't speak right away. They didn't need to. The moment was enough. "Are you sure about this?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. Curtis smiled and wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. "Every minute of every day," he replied, his voice filled with certainty. Sarah's hand rested on her belly, and Curtis's hand covered hers, his touch warm and reassuring. The baby kicked then, a small flutter against her skin, and Sarah smiled, her eyes meeting Curtis's. "Did you feel that?" she asked softly. "I did," he said, his voice filled with awe. In that moment, Sarah knew this was their forever, the beginning of something real, something beautiful. They had both found a place to call home, a family, a love that chose them, even when they couldn't choose themselves. And as they stood there together, watching the stars begin to appear in the night sky, Sarah felt a peace she hadn't known in years. Tomorrow was still uncertain, but together, they would face whatever came next. And for the first time in a long time, Sarah believed that whatever came, they would be all right. It was a quiet winter morning, snow gently falling outside, the world wrapped in a soft, peaceful blanket of white. Curtis woke to the sound of baby Grace crying, her small voice breaking the stillness of the early hour. Sarah, exhausted from a long night of feeding, was still half asleep, her body drained but her heart full. Curtis smiled softly as he reached out, gently taking their daughter from her crib. "I've got her," he whispered, his voice low and soothing. Sarah, grateful for the moment of rest, nodded and curled up in the bed, closing her eyes for just a few more minutes of sleep. Curtis carried Grace to the nursery, where he softly rocked her in his arms, the warmth of the fire flickering in the corner of the room. As he walked, he looked down at her, dark hair like her father's, but with eyes that mirrored Sarah's. He whispered softly to the tiny girl in his arms, "Your papa was a brave man. He loved your mama very much, and I promise I'll tell you all about him when you're old enough." He paused, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "But I also promise you'll never wonder if you're loved, because you are a little one. You're a Jackson now." The door creaked open quietly, and Sarah stood in the doorway, her eyes filled with tenderness as she watched her family. She had never imagined a life like this, one filled with peace, with love, with second chances. "Papa Curtis?" Emma's voice called out, interrupting the quiet moment. Curtis looked up, his heart swelling. "Yes, sweetheart. Can I hold my sister?" Emma asked, her face glowing with excitement. Curtis smiled, his chest tight with emotion. "Of course, Emma." As he carefully placed Grace in Emma's arms, he watched as his daughter looked at her sister with such love and wonder, a love that had taken root in their family. Sarah stood by the door, tears of joy in her eyes as she looked at her children. This was the family she had dreamed of, the family she never thought she would have again. Grace let out a small coo, and Emma smiled at her, whispering softly to the baby as she rocked her gently. "You're part of us now," Emma said, as if the little girl could understand, "and we're going to take care of you." Curtis and Sarah exchanged a look, a silent understanding passing between them. Their journey had been long, but here they were, together, a family in every sense of the word. And as the snow continued to fall gently outside, they knew they had found something that was theirs, something that would never fade. Their story, their future, had just begun.